Welcome to our next video in general psychology. This time we're going to tackle one of the more interesting and certainly difficult to understand topics, and that's psychological disorders. I say it's difficult not because of the material, but because in trying to understand exactly the why and how someone may have these difficulties, or to start with a bigger question, to figure out just what is abnormal. So in abnormal psychology, we're saying that we're studying a special type of behavior, a behavior that is considered habitual, maladaptive, compulsive. Those are all words we're going to revisit in this video. However, coming to that big question, what exactly is normal? I mean, after all, how can we qualify something as abnormal and then consider it something to be treated if we don't first ask ourselves what is the most normal behavior? Now, for most of us, we define normality in two ways. We ask ourselves, what is the social norms? Meaning, what do most people do in a situation? For example, most people don't cut themselves to relieve stress. Most people don't attack others and steal their positions. Most people don't hear voices that tell them to do things good or bad. So since that is not the majority, we assume those things must be abnormal. However, this is a weak definition. Just because a large group of people does something or doesn't do something doesn't mean it's abnormal. I mean, after all, if I were to come to class and wear a skirt, that would be considered by many abnormal because in our culture, men do not wear that type of clothes. However, there are certainly cultures who do. I mean, after all, look at the Scottish kilts. They have a similar hemline length, but they have a different cultural purpose, a different historical significance. So in this case, fashion is merely fashion, something that changes over time, something that alters based on a culture. So just because you don't seem normal to this particular group, there may be another group out there to where your behavior seems absolutely normal. So it's not enough to say it's abnormal because most people don't do it. Secondly, many of us use the definition of the individual, meaning we ask ourselves what makes us happy, what makes us feel good. And then we say if you do the opposite of that, that must be abnormal. And yes, sometimes this is useful to use similar subjects. I don't want to hurt or harm my body in some way. That doesn't seem like something that would make me happy, therefore that must be abnormal. I don't drink too much or use narcotics in a way that would hurt myself or someone else. So that wouldn't make me happy, therefore that must be abnormal. Well, oh great, that's a good place to start, but once again we run into the difficulty in using such a narrow definition of normality. I mean, after all, there are lots of people that do things that I don't like, that I don't do, but I still think are normal. You know, they don't listen to the same music, they don't wear the same clothes, they don't like the same foods. However, their actions are still what we would consider normal. So using social definitions and using individual definitions are fine, but ultimately they're weak if we're going to talk about this from a truly scientific point of view. We have to come up with a better definition. And so that leads us to the professional. What do psychiatrists and psychologists define abnormal as? Well, it needs to have three things. First, the behavior needs to be deviant. And I don't mean deviant like bad, which is somehow, we sometimes use that word. Deviant means a statistically unusual or abnormality. So if you take a bunch of people, you do the math, and you say most numbers, 90%, 95%, 98% do this, then the deviants are those that are farther away from the norm. They're the rare occurrences. So that's one quality. And some of those examples I mentioned could point to an actual abnormal behavior that needs to be identified. Secondly, and this is probably the one that I look for the most, is the behavior maladaptive. So you could be in a minority of people who dress a certain way, who eat certain types of foods, but that behavior may be perfectly fine. You're perfectly healthy, you're perfectly happy. But behavior that is maladaptive somehow impedes on your function, your ability to live a successful life, or perhaps even put yourself in danger, or perhaps even put others in danger. So dressing in a certain way probably is not going to be maladaptive. However, harming your body or engaging in violent acts to hurt or kill other people, that is definitely maladaptive behavior and sounds more like behavior that should be treated. And finally, time is a big quality in abnormal behavior. How long has this behavior been around, these attitudes, these feelings? For example, If someone that you know passes away, someone that you have a good relationship, it's expected that you would be depressed, that you would grieve in that experience. But that's very different than major depressive disorder, because in this case, while we expect over time those emotions to eventually change, someone with major depressive disorder does not. They are stuck in that depressive symptoms, even over time. So these are probably our three best qualifiers to truly say what's abnormal, at least from a mental health point of view. Now, in the past, we explained people's abnormal or odd or unusual behaviors in quite a different way. The earliest history, of course, points to supernatural explanations, and we've made reference to that in the first chapter, how religion was sort of the lens that we looked at the world, and that included all things, not just the seasons or the crops or the reason for life, but also to answer questions like, why do people do weird or bizarre or strange things? Now, depending on your religion, however, the answers may be very different. For example, many Egyptians had the concept of Ka, sort of what we might call the soul. And they believed that when people were acted abnormal or odd, it's because a part of their Ka had left their body and had not found its way home. It's very different than the interpretation that some medieval Christians had, whereas if there's odd or unusual behavior, it must be demon possession. It's not that something left you, but something else is inside you and must be expelled. Around the 1700s is where we started to see a big shift in not only culture in Europe but across the world, and abandoning supernatural explanations for more mechanical ones. And that led to the development of asylums, these places where we would take people with strange or unusual behaviors and treat them and investigate them. Now, let's be very clear, the early asylums were little more than prisons. They were torturous places where basically we had free reign to experiment on them on the name of science and medicine. Around the 1800s, especially near the end of that century, we saw massive reforms throughout Europe, and those even began to spill over into the U.S., to where we started treating them more like patients and not like prisoners. In fact, today, if you were to walk into a mental health facility, even one that has a lockdown inpatient unit, it still resembles more of a modern medical facility. In fact, many times you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the mental health ward of a medical facility and some other place. Now, today, if you walk into, let's say, one of those modern mental health facilities, and you have a behavior that is considered maladaptive, that you believe or someone else believes needs to be treated, how might we explore, how might we explain, diagnose, or even offer suggestions in helping? There's basically three pillars, three lenses that we use to try to identify why you're doing what you're doing. There's the biological approach, which is just what it sounds. We believe the reason you have this abnormal behavior is due to organic or internal reasons. Maybe you were born with some neurological deficiencies. Maybe neurotransmitters are too high or too low, and that's responsible for certain behaviors. This is often called the medical model, and if you know anyone who's taken medication for behavioral reasons, that's the biological approach. The psychological approach looks at experiences, looks at cognition, thought, looks at things like conditioning. Maybe you've been rewarded or punished for certain behaviors, and that's why we see those abnormal behaviors now. Maybe you have certain perceptions of how the world is, and that's leading you to engage in different or dangerous behaviors. And finally, there's the social cultural approach, the idea that let's look at society in a greater context. Maybe your dangerous behaviors are more a product of a bad environment you're in. Maybe you're part of a low SES family with less resources, less opportunities, and so you engage in more dangerous or risky behaviors because that's the cultural message that is out there. Now, there is this thing called the biopsychosocial model, and basically it acknowledges the fact that it's probably not one of those three categories that's leading to your behavior. It's probably all three interacting with each other in unique ways. Now, how do we know what actual mental illnesses are? Meaning, why is schizophrenia a thing, and who decided that? Well, over the years, psychiatrists, psychologists, and professionals in the medical fields have observed behavior, they classified behavior, they gave things names, and they studied them. And for us in the U.S., one of the most famous and still relevant tools is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, now in its 5th edition. And basically, it uses years of medical, psychological, sociological research to create actual names, categories of mental illness, and offer symptoms and possible treatment courses. Today, if we look at surveys of this country and ask how many men or women show signs of mental illness, the numbers are about 15% of our population at any given time show symptoms of a mental disorder. 6% of those are substance abuses, such as drug abuse and alcohol abuse. So addictions could be part of that as well. Now, in looking at all the different types of mental illnesses, and I haven't got into them now because we're going to tackle several of them by themselves, it is still an important question to ask of us as a culture. Let's assume that someone is found to be schizophrenic by all medical evidence. Someone is found to have bipolar disorder by all medical evidence. If that is true and we believe that, should we hold those people responsible for actions, even those actions that harm themselves or other people? It's a tough question to decide, and I don't have a right answer for you. I can say culturally, generally our answer is a qualified yes, meaning yes, in general, men and women are still held responsible for that. But we say it's qualified because in accounting for mental illness for behavioral problems such as crimes, we may need to seek out a different punishment or perhaps a different treatment course to try to alleviate the problems and to keep those problems from showing up again. One very rare example of this is for the courts to designate someone insane. Now, as you might remember from Chapter 1, I said this is incredibly rare. Less than 1% of all court cases will someone even put the insanity defense on the table. And in those less than 1% of cases, only 1 in 4 will get not guilty by reason of insanity. But I do want you to know it's not a psychological term. There's no word insane that exists or sane that exists in psychological sciences. It's a legal term that the courts. But when a court designates someone that label, they are saying that we acknowledge that this person is so mentally disturbed that they cannot understand what they have done. And this may change how we alter the punishment, alter how we deal with the dilemma. Now, as I mentioned in those myths of psychology in Chapter 1, people who are found insane are not let go. Typically, they are required to be in a state-run mental health facility, and they spend as much time incarcerated. Just they're in a mental facility and not a prison. Though there has been recent push to change that prison system to incorporate more mental illness diagnosis and maybe put our dollars towards the mental health component, not just the incarceration component. But that's a topic for another day. All right, we're going to stop the video here. When we come back, we're going to finally start looking at specific disorders. What I'll do is I'll give you the categories, such as you see here, and then we'll look at 4 or 5 examples of actual mental illnesses found in the DSM that you might be diagnosed with today. See you then.